Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the threshold of death. Your breath slows, the world fades, and an eerie silence settles. What happens next? Do you step into an abyss of nothingness, dissolve into the fabric of the cosmos, or awaken to a reality beyond this one? Like prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave, have we mistaken life's flickering shadows for ultimate reality, only to be freed by death's final revelation? Death has haunted the human mind for millennia, shaping our fears, beliefs, and very sense of meaning. Is it the ultimate annihilation, stripping us of all identity? Or is it merely a doorway, one that civilizations, religions, and thinkers across time have struggled to unlock? From the biological stillness of a lifeless body to the spiritual ascent of the soul, death wears many faces. It is feared and revered, denied and embraced, but never ignored. Yet why do we fear it? Is it the pain, the unknown, or the thought that we might simply cease to be? Psychological studies suggest that much of our existence is shaped by the subconscious terror of death, what Ernest Becker called the denial of death. We build civilizations, create art, and seek legacy, all in an attempt to defy our own impermanence. But if death is inevitable, should we fear it, or, as Socrates claimed, welcome it as the greatest mystery? To understand death is to confront life itself, and perhaps in that confrontation we might finally learn how to live. Death is a biological certainty, a process that unfolds in precise and measurable ways, yet it remains one of the greatest mysteries of existence. It begins with the body gradually shutting down, as if an intricate machine, once perfectly synchronized, starts failing part by part. In the final moments, the heartbeat slows, the lungs struggle to draw in air, and the brain, which has orchestrated every function of life, loses its rhythm. Oxygen deprivation leads to confusion, fading awareness, and ultimately unconsciousness. The body enters a stage known as clinical death, where the heart has stopped, but some cells remain active for minutes or even hours. Brain death, however, is the true point of no return, where all brain function ceases, including the brainstem, which controls involuntary functions like breathing and heartbeat. Without oxygen, neurons rapidly die, and the body can no longer sustain itself. Within hours, cells begin to break down, releasing enzymes that cause tissue decay. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles, sets in as chemical changes occur, followed by decomposition, where bacteria and microorganisms begin breaking down the body, returning it to the earth. This physical transformation has fascinated and terrified humankind for millennia, leading to deep questions about when death truly occurs and whether it is a permanent state. Throughout history, civilizations have sought to define and understand death in ways that go beyond its biological aspects. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an end but a transition, where the soul, or Ka, separated from the body and embarked on a journey to the afterlife. To ensure safe passage, they preserved the body through mummification, believing that a well-preserved corpse allowed the soul to recognize its earthly form. The ancient Greeks viewed death through a more philosophical lens, distinguishing between the physical cessation of life and the soul's continued existence in Hades. In many early cultures, breath was considered the defining element of life, leading to a belief that the final exhalation marked the departure of the soul. Medieval medicine often relied on external signs, such as lack of movement or a cold body, to declare someone dead. But without modern technology, premature burials were alarmingly common. The search for a precise definition of death has persisted across time, as different societies attempted to distinguish between apparent death, where signs of life are temporarily undetectable, and irreversible death, where life has undeniably ended. In modern medicine, defining death has become more precise but no less complex. Historically, death was associated with the cessation of the heartbeat and breathing, but advances in medical technology complicated this understanding. The Harvard criteria for brain death, established in 1968, provided a new framework, stating that death occurs when brain activity irreversibly stops, even if artificial life support maintains breathing and circulation. Brain death is determined through a series of clinical tests, including the absence of brainstem reflexes, a lack of response to pain, and the inability to breathe without mechanical assistance. Medical imaging, such as EEGs and cerebral blood flow scans, can confirm the absence of brain activity. Unlike in ancient times, where the definition of death was often uncertain, modern medicine relies on rigorous criteria to distinguish between temporary unconsciousness, comas, and true death. Despite these advancements, Debates continue about whether brain death should be the sole determinant of death, as some cultures and religions argue that a beating heart, even if sustained artificially, signifies life. This tension between biological definitions and cultural beliefs highlights the ongoing struggle to pinpoint the precise moment when life ends. One of the most puzzling phenomena in the study of death is the near-death experience, reported by individuals who have been declared clinically dead but later revived. These experiences often include sensations of floating outside the body, moving through a tunnel, encountering deceased loved ones, or feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. Some accounts describe seeing a bright light or experiencing a life review, where past memories flash before the mind. Scientists have attempted to explain these occurrences through physiological and neurological mechanisms. Lack of oxygen in the brain, the release of endorphins, and electrical surges in dying neurons have all been proposed as explanations. Studies conducted on cardiac arrest patients reveal that some individuals maintain conscious awareness for a brief period after their heart stops, suggesting that death may not be as instantaneous as previously thought. Researchers at the University of Virginia and New York University have conducted studies documenting verifiable cases where revived patients recall details of their surroundings during unconsciousness, challenging conventional views on the nature of consciousness. While skeptics argue that near-death experiences are hallucinations or the brain's final surge of activity, others suggest they may provide insight into what, if anything, lies beyond death. Advances in science and technology have led some to question whether death is truly irreversible. Cryonics, the preservation of human bodies at extremely low temperatures, is one of the most controversial attempts to defy mortality. The idea behind cryonics is that if the body can be preserved before irreversible damage occurs, future medical technology may be able to restore it to life. Individuals who undergo cryopreservation have their bodies cooled with liquid nitrogen to halt biological decay, in the hope that one day, advances in medicine will allow for resuscitation. However, current science faces significant obstacles, including ice crystal formation in tissues and the unknown effects of long-term freezing on brain function. Critics argue that even if physical revival becomes possible, the continuity of consciousness and personal identity remains uncertain. Some researchers are exploring alternative approaches, such as mind uploading, where digital consciousness could theoretically be preserved beyond physical death. While cryonics remains speculative, the pursuit of life extension raises profound ethical and philosophical questions about what it means to die and whether death is a fundamental part of being human. Death, in its biological and scientific dimensions, is both inevitable and mysterious. Despite centuries of study, it continues to challenge human understanding, forcing us to confront its nature with both logic and speculation. From ancient rituals to modern medical advancements, humanity has sought to define, delay, and even overcome death, yet its finality remains uncertain. As science progresses, the line between life and death may shift once again, reshaping our perceptions of mortality and the human experience. Plato and Socrates viewed death not as an end, but as a transition, a gateway to a higher form of existence where the soul, freed from the limitations of the body, could attain ultimate truth. Socrates, in particular, approached death with a sense of calm and even curiosity, a perspective that was most clearly articulated in Plato's dialogue Phaedo, which recounts Socrates' final moments before his execution. In this dialogue, Socrates argues that true philosophers spend their lives preparing for death, as philosophy itself is an exercise in separating the soul from the distractions of bodily needs. According to Plato, the soul is immortal, existing before birth and continuing after death. He likens the body to a prison that confines the soul, distorting its ability to perceive reality. In life, people are attached to physical sensations and desires, but death liberates the soul from these distractions, allowing it to engage with pure knowledge, which cannot be fully grasped while encumbered by a material body. For this reason, Socrates does not fear death. He believes that those who have lived a life of virtue and wisdom should welcome it, as it is a reunion with truth itself. To support this idea, Plato presents several arguments for the soul's immortality. One of the most famous is the theory of recollection, which suggests that learning is merely the process of remembering knowledge that the soul already possessed before birth. If the soul existed before life, it must also exist after death, moving through cycles of reincarnation or ascending to a realm of pure forms. Another argument is the affinity argument, which states that the soul, being invisible and eternal like the divine, cannot be destroyed like the physical body. The final argument, known as the argument from opposites, asserts that just as life emerges from death, death must also lead back to life, implying a continuous cycle of existence. Socrates does not claim to have absolute knowledge of what happens after death, but he is confident that no harm can come to a good soul. His acceptance of death as a philosopher's final lesson is demonstrated in his calm demeanor as he drinks the poison hemlock, comforting his grieving friends and reaffirming that death is nothing to be feared by those who have sought wisdom and virtue. Aristotle, a student of Plato, took a different approach to the question of death, rejecting the notion of an immortal soul that exists independently of the body. As a naturalist and empiricist, Aristotle believed that all living things follow a natural cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death, and that this process is simply part of the order of the universe. Unlike Plato, who saw the physical world as an imperfect shadow of a higher reality, Aristotle believed that reality is found in the material world itself. He argued that the soul is not a separate entity that continues after death, but rather the essence of a living being, inseparable from the body. For Aristotle, the soul is what gives life and function to an organism, much like the form of a statue is what gives it shape and purpose. Just as a candle's flame ceases to exist when the wax is gone, the soul ceases to exist when the body dies. He saw human life as unique because of its capacity for reason, which he considered the highest function of the soul. But he did not believe that this rational aspect of the soul could survive beyond death. Instead, he viewed death as the natural conclusion of life, neither something to be feared nor something to be celebrated, but simply a necessary process. Aristotle emphasized that the best way to approach mortality was to live a life of virtue, guided by reason, fulfilling one's potential in accordance with nature. He believed that the highest good, eudaimonia or flourishing, is achieved through living well, rather than focusing on what may come after death. Unlike Socrates, who found comfort in the idea of an afterlife, Aristotle accepted death as an inevitable part of existence, one that should not distract from the pursuit of a meaningful and rational life. His view laid the foundation for later naturalistic and scientific approaches to death, shifting the focus from metaphysical speculation to an understanding of life as an integrated whole within the natural world. The Buddhist perspective on death is deeply rooted in the understanding that the self, as people commonly perceive it, is an illusion. According to Buddhist teachings, the idea of a fixed and permanent self is a false construct created by human attachment and ignorance. The Buddha taught that all things, including human identity, are impermanent and constantly changing. This concept, known as anatta or non-self, means that what people consider to be their essence is actually a collection of ever-changing thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations. Death, in this view, is not the end of a self because there was never a truly fixed self to begin with. Instead, death is simply a transition in the continuous flow of existence. This idea is closely tied to the doctrine of anicca, or impermanence, which teaches that everything in the universe is in a state of constant flux. Just as a river appears to be a single unified entity, but is actually made up of ever-moving water, so too is human existence a continuous process rather than a stable being. In death, the physical body dissolves, but the chain of cause and effect, known as karma, continues. This is why Buddhists do not see death as a final extinction, but as a transformation. The consequences of one's actions shape what comes next, whether that be rebirth or, in the ultimate goal of Buddhism, the attainment of nirvana. Nirvana is not a place but a state of liberation, free from the cycles of birth and death. Those who attain enlightenment understand that they were never truly separate from the universe to begin with, and thus the fear of death fades. Many Buddhist traditions engage in meditative practices that confront the reality of death directly, such as contemplating the decomposition of the body or reflecting on the impermanence of life. These practices are meant to cultivate wisdom and detachment, allowing individuals to live without clinging to illusions. The Buddhist perspective encourages people to see death not as a loss, but as a natural continuation of existence, emphasizing that the best way to prepare for death is to live a life of compassion, awareness, and inner peace. Hinduism offers a different but equally profound understanding of death, one that is deeply intertwined with the concepts of samsara and karma. Unlike the Buddhist view, which denies a permanent self, Hinduism teaches that an eternal soul, or Atman, exists within each individual. This soul is not bound to any single life, but instead moves through countless cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. This process, known as samsara, is governed by karma, the law of cause and effect that dictates the conditions of one's next existence based on their actions in this life. Good deeds and virtuous living lead to a higher rebirth, while harmful actions create suffering in future lives. Death, therefore, is not an end but a doorway to another chapter of existence, one shaped by the moral weight of past choices. The ultimate goal of Hindu spirituality is to break free from this cycle and attain moksha, or liberation, which is the realization of oneness with the divine. Different Hindu traditions offer varying paths to moksha, whether through devotion, knowledge, meditation, or selfless action. The Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most revered texts, presents death as an illusion when viewed from the perspective of the eternal soul. In this dialogue between Krishna and the warrior Arjuna, Krishna reassures Arjuna that the soul is never truly destroyed, only the body is. This teaching encourages individuals to face death with courage, knowing that their essence continues beyond physical existence. Hindu funeral traditions reflect this belief in the continuity of life. Bodies are often cremated to symbolize the release of the soul, and rituals such as the Shraddha ceremony are performed to help guide the departed spirit toward its next destination. Many Hindus believe that by living a life of dharma, or righteous duty, they can improve their future rebirths and ultimately attain liberation. Death in Hinduism is therefore not a tragedy, but a natural and necessary part of the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, approached death with a mindset of acceptance and resilience, believing that the fear of death is one of the greatest obstacles to a virtuous life. Unlike the Eastern traditions of Buddhism and Hinduism, which focus on the cycles of existence, Stoicism is rooted in the belief that individuals must align themselves with the natural order of the universe, accepting what is beyond their control. Death, in this view, is not something to be feared because it is simply a part of nature. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, frequently reflected on death in his writings, reminding himself that it is no different from the changing of seasons or the passing of time. He saw death as neither good nor bad, but simply as what happens to all living things. To resist death is to resist nature itself, which leads only to suffering. Instead, he encouraged people to focus on what they can control, which is their own actions and character. He advised living each day as if it were the last, not in reckless indulgence, but with mindfulness and purpose. Seneca, another prominent Stoic thinker, took a similar approach, emphasizing that death should be met with tranquility rather than anxiety. He argued that people waste much of their lives worrying about the inevitable, when instead they should be using that time to cultivate wisdom and virtue. In his letters, he reassured his friend Lucilius that death is not the loss that people imagine it to be, because once it arrives, there is no longer a self to experience it. He compared death to the state before birth, a time of non-existence that people do not fear. By realizing that life is short and uncertain, Stoics believed that one could develop a mindset of detachment, appreciating each moment without clinging to it. This perspective is reflected in the Stoic practice of memento mori, or the contemplation of death, which serves as a reminder that life is fleeting and should be lived with integrity. The Stoics did not promise an afterlife or reincarnation, but they offered something equally powerful: the idea that one can face death without fear by living in accordance with reason, virtue, and acceptance of the natural order. Their philosophy teaches that the best way to prepare for death is to live so well that when the end comes, it is met with peace rather than regret. Throughout history, religions and spiritual traditions have sought to understand death not as an end but as a transition into another state of existence. Each belief system offers a unique vision of what happens beyond this life, shaping how people live, mourn, and prepare for their eventual departure. Christianity presents death as a moment of divine judgment, where the soul faces the consequences of its earthly actions. The central premise of Christianity is eternal life, granted to those who have faith in God and follow His teachings. According to Christian doctrine, death is not the destruction of the soul, but a passage into either heaven, a place of eternal peace and unity with God, or hell, a realm of separation from divine grace. The idea of heaven is often depicted as a place of love, joy, and reunion with the righteous, while hell is described as a state of suffering for those who have rejected goodness. Some Christian traditions also believe in purgatory, a temporary state where souls undergo purification before entering heaven. The concept of resurrection plays a crucial role in Christian eschatology, particularly the belief that Jesus Christ conquered death and that at the end of time, all the dead will be raised for final judgment. This belief in an afterlife gives many Christians a sense of hope and comfort in the face of mortality, encouraging them to live in accordance with divine will so that they may attain eternal salvation. Death, in Christian thought, is not to be feared but rather embraced as a return to God, where the faithful will find everlasting peace. Islam also teaches that death is not the end, but a transition into the afterlife, where the soul embarks on a journey that culminates in the Day of Judgment. According to Islamic belief, when a person dies, their soul enters a state known as barzakh, an intermediate realm between life and the final resurrection. In this phase, the soul experiences either peace or torment, depending on its earthly deeds. The Quran describes the afterlife as a moment of reckoning when every individual will stand before God and be judged based on their faith and actions. Those who have lived righteously, obeying divine commandments and acting with justice and compassion, will be rewarded with Jannah, a paradise of beauty, love, and divine presence. Those who have committed wrongdoing and turned away from righteousness will face Jahannam, a place of purification and consequence. The idea of divine justice is central to Islamic teachings, reinforcing the belief that every action in life has significance beyond the physical world. Many Muslims view death as a reminder of the transient nature of life and the importance of living in a way that reflects faith and moral responsibility. Islamic burial traditions emphasize simplicity and humility, with the body being washed, wrapped in a white shroud, and buried as soon as possible, reflecting the idea that human life is temporary and should be lived in preparation for the eternal. The belief in resurrection and divine justice gives meaning to suffering and reinforces the idea that life is a test that determines the soul's fate in the afterlife. Judaism offers a diverse range of perspectives on death and the afterlife, reflecting its long history and evolving theological ideas. The Hebrew Bible speaks of Sheol, a shadowy underworld where all the dead reside, neither a place of reward nor punishment, but simply a realm of existence beyond life. Over time, Jewish thought developed more complex ideas about what happens after death. Some Jewish traditions, particularly those influenced by medieval philosophy and mysticism, embrace the idea of resurrection, believing that at the end of time, the righteous will be restored to life in a renewed world. Other traditions emphasize the moral legacy that individuals leave behind, suggesting that immortality is found not in an afterlife, but in the lasting impact of one's deeds, teachings, and relationships. The Talmud and later Jewish writings introduce the idea of Olam Haba, the world to come, which is often described as a state of spiritual fulfillment where souls experience closeness to God. Some Jewish thinkers, particularly in Kabbalah, discuss reincarnation as part of the soul's journey toward ultimate perfection. Unlike Christianity and Islam, which often focus on the moment of divine judgment, Jewish thought tends to emphasize the importance of righteous living in the present rather than concern over the specifics of the afterlife. The rituals surrounding death in Judaism, including the practice of sitting Shiva, are designed to honor the deceased while also providing comfort and structure for the grieving. In many ways, Jewish perspectives on death reflect a balance between mystery and moral responsibility, encouraging individuals to focus on living a good life rather than fixating on what comes after. Eastern mysticism, particularly in Taoism, approaches death with a sense of acceptance rather than anxiety. Taoist philosophy teaches that life and death are simply two aspects of the same natural process, much like the changing of seasons or the flow of a river. Rather than viewing death as a disruption, Taoism sees it as a return to the Tao, the fundamental essence that underlies all things. Just as a wave is not separate from the ocean but merely a temporary form, so too is human life part of an ever-moving cycle. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, encourages people to embrace the flow of existence rather than resist it, suggesting that fear of death arises only from attachment to the self. In Taoist thought, resisting death is as unnatural as resisting sleep or the falling of leaves in autumn. Many Taoist practices, including meditation and energy cultivation, are designed to help individuals align with the natural rhythms of life so that they can approach death with peace and harmony. Taoist immortality, rather than being a literal continuation of the self, is often understood as a deep merging with the universe, a state where individual identity dissolves into the infinite. Unlike religious traditions that focus on judgment or resurrection, Taoism encourages an attitude of effortless acceptance, where death is not seen as an end but as a transformation into something greater. This perspective fosters a sense of calm in the face of mortality, allowing individuals to live with greater awareness and appreciation of the present moment. Many indigenous and animist traditions around the world view death as part of an ongoing relationship between the living and the spirits of ancestors. In these belief systems, the boundary between life and death is often more fluid than in Western religious traditions. Many indigenous cultures believe that the dead continue to influence the world of the living, offering guidance and protection to their descendants. Rituals honoring the ancestors are central to these traditions, ensuring that the spirits of the deceased remain connected to their families and communities. For example, in many African and Native American cultures, ancestors are seen as intermediaries between humans and the spiritual world, maintaining a sacred presence in everyday life. In some traditions, shamans and spiritual leaders communicate with the spirits of the dead, seeking wisdom and guidance for the community. Death is not viewed as a loss, but as a transition into a different form of existence, where the departed continue to participate in the life of the tribe or family. Many animist cultures also see death as part of the natural cycle of the earth, where human beings, like plants and animals, return to the land that gave them life. This view fosters a deep sense of connection to nature and the universe, reinforcing the idea that death is not an event to be feared, but a passage into another form of being. Whether through ancestor worship, reincarnation, or spiritual communication, indigenous traditions emphasize continuity rather than finality, allowing individuals to see death as a continuation of their place within the greater web of existence. These perspectives offer a profound sense of belonging and purpose, where death is not a solitary experience, but a reunion with the forces that have shaped life since the beginning of time. Epicurus approached the question of death with a simplicity that was both radical and comforting. He believed that much of human suffering comes not from death itself, but from the fear of it. To ease this fear, he presented a logical argument that has influenced philosophical thought for centuries. Epicurus taught that death is nothing to us because when we exist, death does not, and when death comes, we no longer exist. This means that there is no moment in which we actually experience death. It is not a state of suffering or a painful transition, but rather the complete absence of sensation, thought, and awareness. Since all pain and pleasure require consciousness, and death is the absence of consciousness, it follows that death cannot harm us. This idea was meant to free people from the unnecessary anxiety that often accompanies the thought of dying. He argued that the true focus of life should not be on what happens after death, but on how to live in a way that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering. Epicurus believed that people waste too much time fearing an event that will never actually be experienced. He compared this fear to a child being afraid of the dark, something that holds no real danger but still causes unnecessary distress. Instead of dreading death, he encouraged people to cultivate a life filled with simple pleasures, deep friendships, and a peaceful mind. He dismissed the notion of an afterlife, arguing that the soul, like the body, is made of atoms and dissolves at death. Because of this, there's no need to fear punishment or suffering in an afterlife. Many of his followers found solace in this view, as it allowed them to live without the constant burden of existential dread. Epicurus believed that the fear of death often leads people to seek power, wealth, and fame in an attempt to make themselves feel immortal. However, he argued that these pursuits only lead to more suffering as they distract from the simple joys that truly make life meaningful. His philosophy encourages a shift in perspective, teaching that the only rational way to approach death is with indifference. By fully accepting that death is a natural and inevitable part of life, individuals can free themselves from fear and focus on living in the present moment. Heidegger, on the other hand, took a vastly different approach, arguing that the awareness of death is not something to be ignored or dismissed, but rather something that gives life its deepest meaning. In his philosophy, death is not just an event that happens at the end of life, but a defining feature of existence itself. He introduced the concept of being toward death, which suggests that human beings are unique because they are aware of their own mortality. Unlike other creatures who simply live without reflecting on their eventual end, humans exist with the knowledge that they will one day die. This awareness creates an existential tension as people try to find meaning in a life that is ultimately finite. Heidegger believed that most people avoid thinking about death because it is unsettling. Instead, they distract themselves with routines, societal expectations, and the pursuit of external validation. He referred to this state of distraction as inauthentic living, where individuals lose themselves in meaningless activities rather than confronting the reality of their own existence. However, he argued that true authenticity comes from facing death head-on. When people accept their mortality, they are forced to take responsibility for their lives, making deliberate choices that reflect their deepest values. In this way, death becomes a motivating force rather than something to fear. The realization that life is limited pushes people to live with urgency, to create, to love, and to experience life fully. Heidegger believed that by embracing being toward death, individuals could free themselves from the illusions of permanence and live with a deeper sense of purpose. He rejected the idea that death should be seen as an interruption or an unfortunate event. Instead, he saw it as the horizon that gives life its shape and significance. Without death, time would lose its meaning, and choices would have no weight. This perspective is both unsettling and liberating because it forces individuals to acknowledge that their time is finite, making each moment more valuable. Heidegger did not offer comfort in the form of an afterlife or the dissolution of consciousness like Epicurus. Instead, he presented death as an essential part of what it means to be human. The challenge he posed was not to eliminate the fear of death, but to use it as a guide for how to live. He suggested that only by fully grasping the reality of death can people break free from conformity and create a life that is truly their own. His philosophy serves as a reminder that every action, every relationship, and every pursuit is meaningful precisely because it exists within the shadow of mortality. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus both grappled with the meaning of death in a world they saw as fundamentally indifferent to human existence. They were existentialists, but Camus in particular is often associated with absurdism, the idea that human beings search for meaning in a universe that offers none. For both thinkers, death is the ultimate confrontation with this absurdity. Sartre argued that without an inherent purpose given by a divine being or the universe itself, humans are thrown into existence without a predetermined meaning. This realization can be unsettling, as it forces individuals to acknowledge that life has no intrinsic significance beyond what they choose to create. Death, in Sartre's view, is the absolute end of consciousness, stripping away any possibility of redemption or continuation. There is no afterlife, no grand cosmic plan, only the stark reality that one day all experience ceases. But rather than seeing this as a source of despair, Sartre saw it as an opportunity for radical freedom. Since there is no external meaning imposed on life, people are entirely responsible for shaping their own existence. He rejected the idea of escaping into illusions or false comforts, urging individuals to embrace the weight of their choices and live authentically. The awareness of death should not paralyze people with fear, but should push them to act with purpose, knowing that time is limited. Camus took this idea further by exploring how people react to the absurdity of death. He famously compared the human condition to the myth of Sisyphus, a figure condemned to roll a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down for eternity. Camus saw life as similarly repetitive and meaningless when viewed from a purely rational perspective. If death is inevitable and life has no inherent meaning, does this mean existence is futile? Camus argued that the only honest response is rebellion, not in the sense of fighting against an external enemy, but in the refusal to surrender to despair. He believed that people should embrace life despite its absurdity, finding joy in the simple act of living even without ultimate purpose. This is what he called the absurd hero, the person who acknowledges the lack of meaning yet continues to create meaning through their own actions. For Camus, death is not something to be feared because it is the very thing that gives urgency to life. If people had infinite time, there would be no need to act, no pressure to experience, no reason to create. The knowledge that life is finite makes every moment precious. In this way, Camus did not see death as a failure or a loss, but as an essential part of what makes life meaningful in the first place. His philosophy encourages people to find beauty and purpose not in grand eternal truths, but in the fleeting and everyday moments that make up human existence. While Sartre and Camus approached death philosophically, psychological studies have examined how people actually cope with the knowledge of their own mortality. One of the most influential theories in this field is terror management theory, which explores how the awareness of death influences human behavior, emotions, and culture. The theory is based on the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker, who argued that much of human civilization is built as a defense mechanism against the fear of death. According to this perspective, humans are unique in their ability to recognize their own mortality, which creates an existential anxiety that must be managed in order to function. Terror management theory suggests that people cope with this anxiety by investing in cultural worldviews, religious beliefs, and social identities that provide a sense of meaning and continuity by aligning themselves with something larger than themselves, whether it be a nation, a religion, or a philosophical ideal. Individuals can feel that they are part of something that will outlive them. This explains why people are often drawn to symbols of immortality, such as monuments, traditions, and legacies. Psychological experiments have shown that when people are reminded of their mortality, they tend to become more attached to their cultural beliefs, more defensive of their values, and more likely to seek comfort in familiar social structures. This can manifest in both positive and negative ways. On one hand, it encourages people to pursue meaningful contributions, such as creating art, raising families, or working for social progress. On the other hand, it can also lead to hostility toward those with different beliefs, as the presence of alternative worldviews can threaten the sense of security that people derive from their own. Different cultures have developed unique ways of managing death anxiety. In Western societies, where individualism is highly valued, death is often pushed out of everyday awareness, hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes rather than openly discussed. Many people seek comfort in personal achievements and legacy building, believing that their contributions to the world will allow them to live on in some form. In contrast, many Eastern traditions emphasize the acceptance of death as a natural part of existence. In Buddhist cultures, meditation on death is a common practice meant to cultivate detachment and inner peace. By regularly contemplating mortality, individuals learn to let go of attachments and approach death with a sense of calm. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead is a celebration that embraces death as part of life, allowing families to honor their ancestors in a joyful and communal way rather than in fear and sorrow. Indigenous cultures often see death as a transition rather than an end, with ancestral spirits continuing to play a role in the lives of the living. These different perspectives highlight the deep connection between cultural beliefs and how people cope with the inevitability of death. Despite the variations, what remains constant across cultures and psychological studies is the fundamental human need to find meaning in the face of mortality. Whether through existential philosophy, religious faith, or cultural traditions, people seek ways to integrate the knowledge of death into their lives without being overwhelmed by it. Some, like Sartre and Camus, argue that meaning must be created by the individual, while others find comfort in the continuity of cultural and spiritual traditions. Terror management theory provides a framework for understanding why people react to death in such deeply emotional and often contradictory ways. It explains why reminders of mortality can lead to acts of kindness and creativity, but also to fear-driven behaviors that divide people. Ultimately, the fear of death is not just about the loss of life, but about the loss of meaning. The challenge, then, is to find a way to live fully in the knowledge that life is temporary, whether by embracing existential freedom, seeking connection with something greater, or simply learning to appreciate the fleeting beauty of the present moment. Euthanasia and assisted suicide have long been debated as ethical and moral dilemmas that challenge the very meaning of life and death. At the heart of the debate is the question of whether individuals have the right to choose their own death, particularly in cases of unbearable suffering and terminal illness. Those who support euthanasia argue that forcing a person to endure prolonged pain against their will is an unnecessary cruelty, one that violates personal autonomy and dignity. They believe that just as people have the right to make choices about their lives, they should also have the right to determine when and how they die. Opponents, however, argue that legalizing euthanasia risks devaluing human life, opening the door to potential abuse, and placing vulnerable individuals at risk of being pressured into ending their lives prematurely. The case of Brittany Maynard brought widespread attention to the issue. Brittany was a young woman diagnosed with terminal brain cancer who chose to end her life through physician-assisted suicide rather than endure the inevitable suffering that awaited her. She moved to a state where assisted suicide was legal and shared her story with the world, sparking a global discussion about the right to die. Many saw her decision as an act of personal strength, a way of reclaiming control over her own fate in the face of an incurable disease. In contrast, many Eastern traditions emphasize the acceptance of death as a natural part of existence. In Buddhist cultures, meditation on death is a common practice meant to cultivate detachment and inner peace. By regularly contemplating mortality, individuals learn to let go of attachments and approach death with a sense of calm. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead is a celebration that embraces death as part of life, allowing families to honor their ancestors in a joyful and communal way rather than in fear and sorrow. Indigenous cultures often see death as a transition rather than an end, with ancestral spirits continuing to play a role in the lives of the living. These different perspectives highlight the deep connection between cultural beliefs and how people cope with the inevitability of death. Despite the variations, what remains constant across cultures and psychological studies is the fundamental human need to find meaning in the face of mortality. Whether through existential philosophy, religious faith, or cultural traditions, people seek ways to integrate the knowledge of death into their lives without being overwhelmed by it. Some, like Sartre and Camus, argue that meaning must be created by the individual, while others find comfort in the continuity of cultural and spiritual traditions. Terror management theory provides a framework for understanding why people react to death in such deeply emotional and often contradictory ways. It explains why reminders of mortality can lead to acts of kindness and creativity, but also to fear-driven behaviors that divide people. Ultimately, the fear of death is not just about the loss of life, but about the loss of meaning. The challenge, then, is to find a way to live fully in the knowledge that life is temporary, whether by embracing existential freedom, seeking connection with something greater, or simply learning to appreciate the fleeting beauty of the present moment. Euthanasia and assisted suicide have long been debated as ethical and moral dilemmas that challenge the very meaning of life and death. At the heart of the debate is the question of whether individuals have the right to choose their own death, particularly in cases of unbearable suffering and terminal illness. Those who support euthanasia argue that forcing a person to endure prolonged pain against their will is an unnecessary cruelty, one that violates personal autonomy and dignity. They believe that just as people have the right to make choices about their lives, they should also have the right to determine when and how they die. Opponents, however, argue that legalizing euthanasia risks devaluing human life, opening the door to potential abuse, and placing vulnerable individuals at risk of being pressured into ending their lives prematurely. The case of Brittany Maynard brought widespread attention to the issue. Brittany was a young woman diagnosed with terminal brain cancer who chose to end her life through physician-assisted suicide rather than endure the inevitable suffering that awaited her. She moved to a state where assisted suicide was legal and shared her story with the world, sparking a global discussion about the right to die. Many saw her decision as an act of personal strength, a way of reclaiming control over her own fate in the face of an incurable disease. Others, however, worried that allowing assisted suicide could lead to a slippery slope where society begins to treat life as something conditional, valuable only when free of suffering. The debate continues to divide legal systems, medical communities, and religious traditions, as the question of whether the right to die is a fundamental human right remains unresolved. Capital punishment raises similarly complex ethical questions, but shifts the focus from personal choice to societal judgment. While euthanasia revolves around the question of whether an individual has the right to end their own life, capital punishment asks whether the state has the right to take a life as a form of justice. Throughout history, societies have used the death penalty as the ultimate punishment for crimes considered too severe to be met with lesser consequences. Supporters argue that capital punishment serves as a deterrent, preventing potential criminals from committing violent acts out of fear of execution. They also believe that certain crimes are so heinous that justice can only be served through the taking of the perpetrator's life. Opponents, however, challenge this view by pointing out the irreversible nature of the death penalty, the possibility of wrongful convictions, and the moral implications of allowing the state to decide who deserves to die. Many studies have questioned the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent, showing that crime rates do not necessarily decrease in countries that implement the death penalty. There is also the issue of bias and inequality within legal systems, where factors such as race, socioeconomic status, and access to quality legal representation can influence who is sentenced to death. The idea of justice becomes even more complicated when considering cases where individuals have been exonerated after spending years on death row. The question remains whether a system that has the potential to execute innocent people can ever be justified. Some philosophers argue that a society that sanctions killing, even in the name of justice, risks becoming desensitized to violence, reinforcing the very behaviors it seeks to eliminate. In many parts of the world, the trend has been toward the abolition of capital punishment, with countries recognizing that the risk of error and the ethical concerns outweigh any perceived benefits. However, in other societies, it remains a deeply ingrained part of the legal system, reflecting a broader philosophical divide about the nature of justice and the role of the state in determining life and death. War and genocide represent the most extreme examples of how societies justify the taking of life on a massive scale. Unlike euthanasia, where death is framed as an act of mercy, and capital punishment, where it is considered a form of justice, war and genocide introduce the element of dehumanization, stripping individuals of their personhood to justify their killing. Throughout history, war has been rationalized as a necessary means of protecting nations, preserving ideologies, or securing resources. Governments often frame war as a noble pursuit, using rhetoric that portrays enemies as threats to be eliminated rather than as human beings. This dehumanization process allows societies to distance themselves from the reality of violence, making it easier to justify mass death. Soldiers are trained to see the enemy as an abstract other, a faceless opponent rather than a person with a life, a family, and emotions. Propaganda plays a crucial role in this process, reinforcing narratives that depict the opposing side as evil or subhuman, further reducing the psychological burden of taking lives. Genocide takes this dehumanization to its most horrifying extreme. Unlike war, where death is often seen as a byproduct of conflict, genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of an entire group based on ethnicity, religion, or ideology. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and the Armenian genocide are among the darkest chapters in human history, where entire populations were marked for destruction simply for existing. What makes genocide particularly chilling is the way it is often carried out not by distant armies, but by ordinary people who have been convinced that their victims are not fully human. Political leaders, media, and cultural institutions play a role in shaping these beliefs, normalizing acts that would otherwise be unthinkable. The philosophical question that arises from war and genocide is whether societies can ever truly move beyond the cycle of violence. Many thinkers argue that as long as people define themselves in opposition to others, viewing differences as threats rather than as part of the richness of human existence, the potential for such atrocities will always exist. The challenge then is not just to prevent war and genocide through political and legal means, but to address the deeper psychological and philosophical mechanisms that allow societies to justify killing in the first place. Recognizing the humanity in others, even in those who are different or opposed to us, may be the only true path toward breaking the cycle of violence that has shaped so much of human history. John Locke's theory of personal identity is one of the most influential philosophical perspectives on what it means to be a self, and whether that self can persist beyond death. Locke believed that personal identity is not rooted in the physical body or even the soul, but in the continuity of consciousness and memory. He argued that a person remains the same individual over time because they can remember past experiences and connect them to their present sense of self. This was a revolutionary idea because it separated identity from the body, suggesting that a person could theoretically exist beyond their physical form as long as their memories and consciousness persisted. According to Locke, if a person were to wake up in a completely different body but retained all their memories, they would still be the same individual because their sense of self comes from the continuity of their experiences rather than from their physical form. This raises profound questions about death and whether it truly erases the self. If identity is based on memory and consciousness rather than the body, then what happens when the body ceases to function? Do we vanish completely? Or is there a possibility that identity can continue in some form? Locke did not provide a definitive answer to whether consciousness survives death, but his theory laid the groundwork for later debates about the nature of selfhood and the possibility of continuity beyond physical existence. Some philosophers argue that if memory and consciousness could somehow be preserved, then the self could theoretically survive death, not as a biological entity, but as a continuation of awareness in another form. This idea has gained new relevance in modern discussions about artificial intelligence and digital consciousness, where scientists and technologists explore whether the self can be preserved beyond the limitations of the body. The idea of transhumanism and digital immortality builds upon Locke's theory by asking whether technology can extend or even replace the biological self, allowing for the continuation of consciousness beyond death. Transhumanism is a movement that seeks to enhance human capabilities through science and technology, with some of its most ambitious goals focusing on defeating aging and achieving some form of immortality. One of the most intriguing possibilities within transhumanism is the idea of mind uploading, the theoretical process of transferring human consciousness into a digital or artificial system. This concept is based on the idea that the brain is essentially a complex network of electrical signals and biochemical processes, meaning that if these processes could be mapped and replicated in a computer, then a person's mind could continue to exist independently of their biological body. If successful, this could mean that death as we currently understand it would no longer be inevitable. A person could continue thinking, remembering, and interacting with the world long after their physical body has stopped functioning. Some scientists and futurists believe that this could one day be possible through advancements in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and computational modeling. Research in brain-computer interfaces, such as the work being done by companies like Neuralink, is already making progress in connecting human thoughts to digital systems, raising the possibility that one day, entire minds could be preserved in virtual environments. However, this idea is not without controversy. Many question whether a digital copy of a person's mind would truly be the same individual or merely a simulation with no real subjective experience. If a consciousness is uploaded into a machine, does it retain the original person's sense of self? Or does it create an entirely new entity that only appears to think and feel in the same way? There is also the issue of whether digital immortality would preserve the deeper aspects of human existence, such as emotions, intuition, and the experience of being embodied in the physical world. Some critics argue that human identity is deeply connected to the body, with sensory experiences, emotions, and even mortality shaping what it means to be a self. If consciousness were transferred into a non-biological form, would it still be human in the way we understand it today? Beyond the philosophical and ethical questions, the pursuit of digital immortality raises concerns about power, inequality, and the potential consequences of separating the self from the body. If only the wealthy or technologically privileged could afford to upload their minds, it could create a world where some individuals continue indefinitely while others remain bound to the limitations of mortality. There is also the issue of control, as a digital mind could theoretically be altered, copied, or even erased by those who own the technology. Unlike biological death, which is a natural and uncontrollable process, digital immortality would introduce new uncertainties about identity, autonomy, and the possibility of manipulation. Despite these concerns, the idea of transcending death through technology continues to captivate scientists, philosophers, and futurists alike. Some believe that achieving digital immortality would mark the next stage of human evolution, allowing people to explore new forms of existence beyond the constraints of the physical body. Others see it as a dangerous illusion, arguing that the true essence of being human is in our fleeting embodied experiences and that trying to escape death through technology might strip life of its deepest meaning. Whether or not digital immortality becomes a reality, the mere possibility of it challenges long-held assumptions about life, death, and what it truly means to be a self. In many ways, it forces us to confront the same questions that have been asked for centuries, now with the added complexity of technology reshaping the boundaries of existence. While Locke's theory of personal identity suggested that the self is defined by the continuity of consciousness and memory, the question remains whether such continuity, even if technologically preserved, would be enough to truly overcome death. The search for answers continues, not only in philosophy, but in the laboratories and minds of those who are determined to redefine what it means to be human in an age where technology is beginning to challenge the very limits of life itself. The paradox of legacy is one of the deepest and most enduring questions about human existence and death. It asks whether a person can truly live on after death through the impact they leave behind in memories, art, and ideas. While death brings an undeniable end to the biological self, many argue that something of a person continues to exist as long as they are remembered. Their words are read, their music is heard, or their influence is felt in the lives of others. This idea has been a source of both comfort and existential contemplation for centuries. Some find reassurance in the notion that their actions, creations, and relationships will extend beyond their physical lifespan, forming an invisible thread that weaves into the future. Others question whether such an afterlife of influence is meaningful if the person themselves no longer experiences it. The paradox lies in the fact that while individuals do not consciously persist after death, their existence does not vanish entirely either. They continue in the thoughts of those who remember them, in the cultural and intellectual landscapes they helped shape, and in the ripple effects of their choices. Legacy thus occupies a strange space between presence and absence, challenging the traditional boundary between life and death. History is filled with figures who, despite having died centuries ago, still shape the way people think and live today. Ancient philosophers, in particular, are among the most striking examples of this kind of immortality through ideas. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived thousands of years ago, yet their teachings continue to influence fields as diverse as ethics, politics, science, and art. Socrates, who left no writings of his own, lives on through the works of his student Plato, who recorded his dialogues and preserved his philosophy for future generations. His method of questioning assumptions, known as the Socratic method, remains a cornerstone of philosophical inquiry and education. Though Socrates himself died by drinking poison as punishment for questioning Athenian society, his ideas could not be executed alongside his body. His legacy continued to inspire philosophers, revolutionaries, and scholars across centuries. Plato's own writings laid the foundation for much of Western thought, exploring concepts like justice, the nature of reality, and the ideal society. His academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning, influenced generations of thinkers who carried his ideas forward. Aristotle, in turn, built upon and challenged Plato's ideas, developing systems of logic, ethics, and scientific thought that shaped the intellectual traditions of both the ancient and modern worlds. Though he lived more than 2,000 years ago, his ideas still form the basis of disciplines ranging from biology to political theory. Even today, students, scientists, and philosophers engage with Aristotle's writings, continuing the intellectual conversation he began. The endurance of these philosophers demonstrates that while death ends an individual's conscious experience, it does not necessarily erase their presence from the world. Their thoughts, recorded in writing and passed down through generations, continue to shape human understanding long after their physical bodies have turned to dust. This raises the question of whether ideas and influence are a form of existence in their own right. If a person's thoughts continue to shape reality, are they in some sense still present in the world? Some argue that intellectual and artistic contributions represent a kind of functional immortality, allowing individuals to persist not as biological beings, but as forces that continue to shape the future. This is evident not just in philosophy, but in literature, art, music, and scientific discovery. The works of Shakespeare still inspire playwrights and poets. The theories of Newton continue to define physics. The music of Beethoven is still performed and felt deeply by those who hear it. In this way, the essence of individuals can extend far beyond their physical lifetime, carried forward by those who engage with their legacy. However, the paradox of legacy also raises difficult questions. If a person no longer experiences the world, does it truly matter whether they are remembered? From an existential perspective, the comfort of leaving behind a lasting impact is meaningless if the individual themselves no longer benefits from it. There is also the question of time itself. While some figures have left legacies that have lasted for centuries, the vast majority of human beings are forgotten within a few generations. Even the most famous individuals will one day fade from memory, their works lost or replaced by new ideas and creations. Civilizations rise and fall, languages change, and what was once considered essential knowledge may become obscure or irrelevant. In this sense, legacy is both a form of continuation and an eventual impermanence, a temporary survival in a world that is itself constantly evolving. Yet, despite this impermanence, people continue to seek meaning in the idea of leaving something behind. Parents pass on values and traditions to their children. Artists create works that outlive them. Scientists develop discoveries that future generations build upon. Even those who are not widely remembered still influence the world in ways that are impossible to measure. A single act of kindness can ripple through time, affecting people in ways that the original individual will never know. The paradox of legacy is that it offers a form of survival that is both real and uncertain, meaningful and fleeting. It challenges people to consider what truly matters in life, whether it is the pursuit of fame and recognition or the quieter, less visible impact they have on the world around them. In the end, legacy may not be about achieving immortality, but about participating in the ongoing story of human existence, contributing to something larger than oneself, even if it is only for a short time. René Descartes' theory of dualism is one of the most influential philosophical perspectives on the nature of the mind and its relationship to the body. Descartes argued that human beings are made up of two fundamentally different substances, the physical body, which follows the laws of nature and is subject to decay, and the immaterial mind, which is the seat of thought, reason, and consciousness. He believed that while the body is part of the material world, the mind belongs to a separate, non-physical realm that is not bound by the limitations of space and time. This idea led him to the conclusion that the mind or soul could theoretically exist independently of the body. Descartes famously stated, "I think, therefore I am," suggesting that the ability to think is the most fundamental proof of existence. He argued that even if everything in the physical world were an illusion, the fact that one can doubt, reason, and be self-aware proves that the mind exists as a distinct entity. This separation of mind and body raised profound questions about death and what happens to consciousness after the body ceases to function. If the mind is not dependent on the physical brain, then could it continue to exist in some form even after the body dies? Descartes' view aligned with religious beliefs about the soul, which hold that human consciousness is not destroyed by death, but rather moves on to another realm of existence. However, critics of dualism have pointed out that there is no clear explanation of how an immaterial mind can interact with a physical body. Modern neuroscience suggests that thoughts, emotions, and memories are deeply connected to the brain, and when the brain is damaged or deteriorates, so too does a person's sense of self. If consciousness were truly independent of the body, it should not be affected by brain injury or disease. Yet there is clear evidence that changes in brain structure directly impact mental function. This has led many scientists and philosophers to reject dualism in favor of the idea that the mind is a product of the brain, making the survival of consciousness after death unlikely. However, despite these challenges, the mystery of consciousness remains unsolved, and the question of whether the mind can exist without the body continues to intrigue both philosophers and scientists. In recent years, some researchers have turned to modern physics to explore new explanations for consciousness and its potential survival beyond death. One of the most intriguing theories in this field is the orchestrated objective reduction theory, or OR, developed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. This theory suggests that consciousness is not simply a byproduct of brain activity, but is instead a fundamental part of the universe, connected to the very structure of reality itself. According to OR, consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring within microtubules, tiny structures found inside brain cells. Unlike classical physics, which views the brain as a complex but ultimately mechanical system, quantum mechanics introduces the idea that subatomic particles exist in multiple states at once and only take on definite properties when observed. Penrose and Hameroff propose that the brain does not operate purely through electrical and chemical signals, but also through quantum computations, meaning that consciousness is deeply tied to the strange and unpredictable world of quantum physics. If this is true, then consciousness may not be entirely confined to the brain. Instead, it could exist in a more fundamental way, woven into the very fabric of space and time. This raises the possibility that when a person dies, their conscious experience does not simply vanish, but instead returns to the quantum field, much like a wave returning to the ocean. Some have interpreted this idea as scientific support for the possibility of an afterlife, suggesting that human awareness could persist in some form beyond physical death. However, the OR theory is highly controversial and has not been widely accepted by the scientific community. Critics argue that there is little experimental evidence to support the claim that quantum processes in the brain give rise to consciousness. While quantum mechanics is known to govern the behavior of particles at extremely small scales, it is unclear whether these effects play a meaningful role in the large-scale functioning of the brain. Furthermore, even if quantum physics is involved in consciousness, this does not necessarily mean that consciousness can survive outside of the brain. The theory remains speculative, but it highlights the growing interest in understanding the nature of consciousness from a perspective that goes beyond traditional neuroscience. Whether or not quantum physics holds the key to the mystery of consciousness and death, it challenges the way we think about the mind, suggesting that our understanding of reality itself may be far more complex than we currently imagine. The search for answers continues, bridging the worlds of philosophy, neuroscience, and quantum physics, as scientists and thinkers alike try to unravel one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. Reincarnation is the belief that after death, the soul or consciousness is reborn into a new body, continuing its existence through multiple lifetimes. This idea is found in many religious and spiritual traditions, particularly in Hinduism, Buddhism, and certain indigenous and mystical belief systems. Reincarnation suggests that death is not the end, but rather a transition, where the essence of a person moves forward, shaped by past actions and experiences. The concept of karma is closely tied to reincarnation, teaching that the moral weight of a person's actions influences their next life. Some traditions describe this process as a means of learning and spiritual evolution, where each life provides new opportunities for growth. Others see it as a cycle of suffering from which one must eventually escape through enlightenment or moral purification. But beyond religious beliefs, the question remains whether there is any scientific or empirical evidence to suggest that reincarnation is real. While mainstream science generally dismisses the idea due to the lack of physical proof, there have been thousands of reported cases where individuals, particularly young children, claim to remember past lives with astonishing detail. Some of the most well-documented cases have been investigated by researchers such as Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who spent decades studying children who reported past life memories. Stevenson collected over 2,000 cases from different cultures, many of which involved children providing specific names, locations, and details of events from a life they had supposedly lived before. In some cases, the children's statements could be verified, matching real historical individuals they had no logical way of knowing about. Some children even had birthmarks or physical traits corresponding to wounds or injuries of the deceased individuals they claimed to have been. While skeptics argue that these cases may result from coincidence, cultural conditioning, or subconscious influences, the sheer number of similar reports across different cultures makes the phenomenon difficult to completely dismiss. Researchers continue to explore whether past life memories could be a product of neurological processes, genetic memory, or even unknown aspects of consciousness that have yet to be understood. The belief in spirits and ghosts is closely related to the idea that consciousness survives death in some form. While reincarnation suggests that the soul moves into a new body, the concept of ghosts implies that some part of a person lingers in the physical world after death. Ghost stories have existed in nearly every culture throughout history, from ancient Egyptian and Chinese traditions to medieval European folklore and modern paranormal encounters. Many people claim to have witnessed apparitions, unexplained voices, or strange movements of objects, leading to speculation that spirits continue to exist after the body dies. Parapsychology is the field of study that investigates these phenomena scientifically, attempting to determine whether ghosts are real or whether such experiences can be explained through psychology, neurology, or environmental factors. Some researchers have explored the possibility that strong emotional events, such as traumatic deaths, might leave behind an imprint in a particular location, a concept known as residual haunting. Others have examined whether electromagnetic fields or infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that the human ear cannot consciously hear, might cause feelings of unease or hallucinations that people interpret as ghostly encounters. Studies have shown that certain places thought to be haunted have unusual electromagnetic activity, suggesting that natural environmental factors could be responsible for what people perceive as ghostly presences. However, there are also cases that defy easy explanation. Some paranormal investigators have recorded electronic voice phenomena, where unexplained voices appear on audio recordings even when no one was present. Others have documented cases where multiple independent witnesses report seeing the same apparition in the same location, raising questions about whether there is something beyond ordinary perception at play. Near-death experiences also contribute to the debate, as some individuals report encountering deceased loved ones or feeling a presence that suggests life continues beyond death. While mainstream science remains skeptical, arguing that most ghost sightings can be explained through psychology, misinterpretation, or hoaxes, the persistence of such reports throughout history suggests that the question of what happens after death is far from settled. Some philosophers and scientists speculate that if consciousness is not strictly confined to the brain, it might be possible for some aspect of awareness to persist in ways we do not yet understand. Whether spirits are real or whether they are merely the brain's response to grief, fear, or environmental stimuli, the study of ghosts remains one of the most fascinating and enduring mysteries in the exploration of death and the unknown. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return is one of the most thought-provoking ideas in philosophy, challenging how people perceive time, existence, and the choices they make. The idea suggests that if the universe is infinite and time is cyclical, then every moment of life will repeat endlessly in exactly the same way, with no changes, no alterations, and no escape. Nietzsche presents this idea as a thought experiment rather than a literal scientific claim, asking individuals to consider what it would mean if they had to live their lives over and over again, experiencing every joy, every suffering, and every mistake for eternity. The question forces people to examine whether they are living in a way that they would willingly relive forever. If life is not a one-time event but an endless cycle, then every action takes on a deeper significance. A moment of regret or cruelty is not something that fades into the past, but something that will return again and again, trapping the individual in an endless repetition of their choices. Conversely, if one lives a life of meaning, love, and purpose, then the eternal return transforms into a gift rather than a curse, allowing a person to experience their greatest moments infinitely. Nietzsche presents this idea to challenge complacency and force people to take responsibility for their actions. If one truly accepted the eternal return, then every decision would be made with the full knowledge that it would be lived again forever. This is why Nietzsche saw the eternal return as the ultimate test of self-affirmation. Only those who embrace life in its entirety with all of its suffering and uncertainty can face the eternal return without fear. This idea aligns with Nietzsche's broader philosophy of amor fati, or the love of fate, which teaches that one must embrace life fully, not seeking to escape its difficulties, but to accept and affirm them. The eternal return is a radical demand for authenticity, urging individuals to live as if every moment matters, because in a cyclical universe, every moment will return eternally. Even if one does not believe in the literal truth of this concept, it serves as a powerful psychological and ethical tool, pushing individuals to reconsider their lives and strive to live in a way that they would be willing to repeat forever. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy offers a different yet equally profound perspective on how human beings should approach life and death. Unlike Nietzsche, who focused on the challenge of living with full responsibility in an endless cycle, Frankl centered his philosophy on the search for meaning in the face of suffering and mortality. Frankl was a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed his ideas after enduring unimaginable suffering in Nazi concentration camps. He observed that those who survived were often not the strongest or healthiest, but those who had a deep sense of purpose, a reason to keep living, even in the face of despair. From this, he developed logotherapy, a therapeutic approach based on the idea that the primary human drive is not pleasure, as Freud suggested, or power, as Nietzsche argued, but meaning. Frankl believed that even in the most hopeless situations, people can endure suffering if they see it as part of a greater purpose. He argued that meaning is not something given, but something that must be discovered, often in the most difficult moments of life. For Frankl, the awareness of death is not a source of fear, but a reminder that life is precious and should be lived with intention. Mortality gives urgency to human existence, making every moment valuable because it will not come again. While Nietzsche's eternal return challenges people to live as if they will repeat their choices forever, Frankl's philosophy urges them to live as if they have only one chance, making each action meaningful. He believed that meaning can be found in three main ways: through work and achievements, through love and relationships, and through suffering itself, when it is transformed into personal growth. Even in the darkest times, he insisted that people have the freedom to choose their attitude and response, finding dignity in the ability to assign meaning to their experiences. His ideas resonate deeply with those who seek a way to cope with loss, trauma, or the fear of death. By focusing on meaning rather than despair, logotherapy offers a path toward resilience and inner strength. Unlike some philosophies that view death as an end to be feared or ignored, Frankl saw it as an essential part of what makes life meaningful. If life were endless, it would lose its urgency, and the choices people make would carry less weight. But because life is finite, every moment becomes an opportunity to create something valuable. In this way, Frankl's approach to mortality is not one of resignation, but of empowerment, showing that even in the face of death, human beings can find purpose, and in finding purpose, they can transform their suffering into something meaningful. Different cultures have developed unique ways of understanding and confronting death, shaping the way individuals experience loss, mourning, and the passage of time. Some societies embrace death as a natural and even celebratory part of life, while others push it away, treating it as something to be avoided, feared, or hidden. Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, is one of the most vivid examples of a culture that openly acknowledges and honors death. Rooted in pre-Hispanic traditions and later blended with Catholic influences, this celebration views death not as an end, but as a continuation of existence in another form. Families gather to remember their deceased loved ones, creating altars adorned with photographs, candles, flowers, and offerings of food and drink that the spirits are believed to enjoy. Sugar skulls, papal picado decorations, and marigolds symbolize both the beauty and the impermanence of life. Music, dancing, and storytelling play a central role in the festival, transforming grief into an act of connection and remembrance. Rather than suppressing sorrow, Dia de los Muertos integrates it into daily life, ensuring that death is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as part of the human experience. The celebration fosters a sense of continuity, reinforcing the idea that the dead are not truly gone as long as they are remembered. This perspective creates a relationship with death that is neither morbid nor tragic, but deeply personal and communal, allowing people to express their love for those who have passed without the weight of silence or avoidance. In contrast, many Western societies have developed a far more detached and uneasy relationship with death. In much of modern Western culture, death is often treated as something to be hidden from view, discussed only in moments of necessity, and approached with discomfort. Hospitals and nursing homes have largely replaced the home as the place where people die, distancing families from the experience of a loved one's final moments. Funerals tend to be formal and somber, with an emphasis on closure rather than ongoing remembrance. Unlike traditions such as Dia de los Muertos, where death is integrated into cultural rituals and celebrations, Western societies often emphasize the idea of moving on quickly after loss, sometimes discouraging prolonged grief or public expressions of mourning. The language surrounding death is often softened or avoided altogether, with phrases like passed away or lost replacing direct references to dying. Many industries profit from this avoidance, offering anti-aging products, cosmetic procedures, and medical interventions aimed at prolonging youth and delaying the visible effects of aging, reinforcing the illusion that death is something that can be postponed indefinitely. Even within philosophy and psychology, the Western approach to death has been shaped by existential anxiety, with figures such as Ernest Becker arguing that much of human civilization is built around the denial of death. While technological advancements and medical progress have extended life expectancy, they have also created a paradox in which people live longer but remain largely unprepared for the reality of death. The reluctance to acknowledge mortality can lead to a sense of alienation when death inevitably occurs, making grief more isolating and difficult to process. This avoidance contrasts sharply with cultures that view death as a fundamental part of life, teaching individuals to coexist with the knowledge of their impermanence rather than resisting it. Accepting death can profoundly enhance life, shifting the way people view time, relationships, and personal meaning. When death is recognized as an unavoidable part of existence, life itself becomes more urgent and precious. Many philosophies emphasize that awareness of mortality should not lead to fear, but to a deeper appreciation of the present moment. Stoic thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca encouraged the practice of memento mori, or remembering death, as a way to cultivate wisdom and gratitude. Rather than treating death as an abstract event in the distant future, they believed that reflecting on mortality daily could inspire people to live with greater purpose and integrity. Similarly, existentialist philosophers such as Martin Heidegger argued that confronting death directly allows individuals to break free from superficial distractions and take ownership of their existence. When people understand that their time is limited, they are more likely to focus on what truly matters, whether it is building meaningful relationships, pursuing passions, or leaving behind a legacy of kindness and creativity. The acceptance of death can also provide a sense of peace, reducing anxiety about the unknown and allowing individuals to face life's difficulties with resilience. Many religious and spiritual traditions echo this idea, teaching that embracing death can lead to deeper insight and enlightenment. Buddhist meditation practices often involve contemplating the impermanence of all things, helping practitioners develop detachment from material concerns and a greater sense of inner peace. In cultures where death is accepted rather than feared, people often report feeling a stronger connection to their ancestors, traditions, and the natural cycles of life. This acceptance does not mean passivity or resignation, but rather a conscious choice to live fully, knowing that each moment is fleeting. Death, rather than being an interruption, becomes a reminder of the beauty of existence itself. By acknowledging mortality, people can approach life with a greater sense of presence, making choices that align with their values and appreciating the depth of each experience. Whether through philosophy, spirituality, or cultural traditions, the acceptance of death is not about surrendering to despair, but about recognizing the profound richness of life. In the end, it is not the avoidance of death that brings fulfillment, but the willingness to embrace it as an inseparable part of what it means to be human.